Alright. Hello, my name is Austin Reyes, and today I'm going to be presenting the ethical theory of consequentialism. My required source was the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The ethical theory I chose was consequentialism, and the encyclopedic entry author that I'm using today is Walter Sinnott Armstrong. Alright, so let's get into what consequentialism means. When discussing the definition of consequentialism, Armstrong states the following in section 2 of his entry. Any consequentialist theory must accept the claim that I labeled consequentialism, namely, that certain normative properties depend only on consequences. To put this in simpler terms, let's first explain what normative properties are. Normative properties are basically descriptions of an action. For example, an action can be good or bad. Now, with this knowledge, we can deduct that consequentialism essentially means that the description of an action as good or bad can be determined solely based on the consequences of said action, or rather the outcome. Using the image, I'm going to be giving you an example. So when you set up dominoes parallel to each other and you knock one over, it creates a satisfying visual for you. Let's say, though, someone else set up those dominoes parallel to each other and you knock them down. It could potentially upset or frustrate the person who set up the dominoes because maybe they didn't want the dominoes knocked over in that specific moment. Maybe they didn't want it knocked over at all. This creates a dilemma where you have to weigh the two consequences or the two outcomes and decide then if it's good or bad based on those outcomes. Um, so now we're going to be going into the variations of consequentialism. The first variation we're going over is actual consequentialism. So in section 1 of Armstrong's journal entry, uh, when discussing actual consequentialism, Armstrong stated the following. Whether an act is morally right depends only on the actual consequences as opposed to foreseen, foreseeable, intended, or likely consequences. So to explain this, I'm going to use the previous example that I mentioned in the last slide. In the last slide, I said you knocking over someone else's domino setup could potentially upset or frustrate them. Actual consequentialism only deals with the dilemma if that person does in fact get upset, rather than dealing with the possibility of them being upset. In other words, this form of consequentialism only deals with the consequences after the fact, rather than weighing the possible expected outcomes. Um, Another simple way to describe this would be gambling. If you gamble and you receive the best outcomes, despite if you gamble with high stakes, odds stacked against you, if you win the gamble and if the gamble outcome benefits you, then someone who practices actual consequentialism will view this action as right or good. Now we're going to get into hedonism. In section 1 of Armstrong's journal entry, he says the following about hedonism. The value of the consequences depends only on the pleasures and pains in the consequences. To give a more basic definition, hedonism is the idea that what brings you pleasure is good, and the only thing that can be considered bad is pain. This makes the pleasure um, almost an ultimate goal, or rather the pursuit of pleasure, to be the right choice. An easy example of this is, let's say you choose to go out with your friends um, instead of staying home and doing chores that you were supposed to do. The reason why this would be a good example of hedonism is because for most people, going out with your friends would be the choice that you're making in order to pursue pleasure. You get happy out of going out with your friends, talking to them. Maybe you haven't seen them in a while. Whereas staying home and doing chores could bring you pain or unhappiness even. And if it doesn't bring you those two things, it's still preventing you from going out and pursuing pleasure, which would make this the wrong choice in the view of someone who practices hedonism. So even if staying home and doing chores would bring other benefits outside of just happiness and pleasure, um, in the eyes of a hedonistic view, this would still be the wrong choice because it doesn't pursue pleasure. Our next variation of this ethical theory is pluralistic consequentialism. So, when discussing pluralistic consequentialism, Armstrong states the following in section 3 of his journal entry. Many consequentialists deny that all values can be reduced to any single ground, such as pleasure or desire satisfaction. So they instead adopt a pluralistic theory of value. This is almost a direct counter to hedonism, because this is more um, pluralistic consequentialism takes into consideration multiple different values rather than just considering pleasure. A good example of this can be the choices of choosing to eat at a vegan restaurant rather than eating at your favorite fast food place that serves real meat, despite knowing that you would enjoy the real meat more. Um, in the view of a hedonist, they would pursue the real meat since it brings more pleasure. However, in the view of a pluralistic consequentialist, they would consider the options based on more than just pleasure. Vegan food tends to be more sustainable. It tends to be more ethically made, and in most cases, it's healthier. So this creates a pursuit of value balancing rather than just maximizing pleasure. Now we're going to get into direct consequentialism. In section 1 of Armstrong's entry, he states the following about direct consequentialism. Whether an act is morally right depends only on the consequences of that act itself. This is a very simple form of consequentialism, because you are not thinking about the intentions or the morality behind a person's actions. You are thinking purely about the consequences of said action and weighing the normative properties of whether something is good or bad based only on these consequences or outcomes. An example of this would be telling white lies to somebody. So let's say someone that you care about goes up to you and asks you if you think their makeup looks bad. Now, in this case, you do think that their makeup looks bad, but you tell them that you think it looks good. The reason why a direct consequentialist would view this as a good action is because the outcome of it is the person you care about is confident in their makeup and they're not doubting whether or not their makeup looks bad or not anymore. Um, the morality behind telling a lie is irrelevant because the outcome is positive. Okay, now we're going to be talking about preference utilitarianism. When discussing different types of utilitarianism, Armstrong says the following in section 3 of his journal entry. Utilitarians who adopt this theory of value can then claim that an agent morally ought to do an act if and only if that act maximizes desire satisfaction or preference fulfillment, that is the degree to which the act achieves whether it's desired or preferred. So, what does this mean? Um, Basically, Armstrong is describing preference utilitarianism as the idea that a person doing an action ought to act on the decision based on what maximizes fulfillment um, based upon preference. So this can be preference of a single individual, or this can be preference on all involved parties. So let's talk about vegan practices again. A person who practices preference utilitarianism may oppose eating meat because they can make a easy assumption that the strength of which animals prefer to not go through the um, processes that they do in meat facilities in comparison to the strength of the preference that humans can have to the taste of meat is going to be significantly stronger. So because the animals would have a stronger preference to not suffer the way that they do, um, and the humans will only have a slight strength towards the preference of the taste of meat, preference utilitarianists would probably oppose to eating meat. Another variation that was mentioned was universal consequentialism. So, in section 1 of Armstrong's journal entry, he states the following as a definition to universal consequentialism. Moral rightness depends on the consequences for all people or sentient beings. This basically is a form of consequentialism that weighs the consequences of not only the involved party, but human life in general or any other sentient beings. An example of when universal consequentialism was a big conversation recently was with the COVID-19 vaccine. So when the vaccine was created, there became an ethical dilemma on whether the countries who were rich enough in resources to develop these vaccines should keep them for themselves in order to make sure that their country first is safe in case of any future potential outbreaks. or if they should distribute it to the countries who can't develop their own vaccines, or poorer countries to be more specific. From the view of a universal consequentialist, the positive consequence of helping a larger population outweighs the consequence of hoarding it for your own country. In order to prevent future outbreaks, because there's a potential possibility that the outbreak won't happen again, and in that case, the vaccine was hoarded for no reason when it could have helped a larger number of people. Now, we are going to be getting into the critiques that I found within this journal entry. So, in section 3, Armstrong states that some contemporaries of Bentham and Mill argued that hedonism lowers the value of human life to the level of animals because it implies that, as Bentham said, an unsophisticated game such as push-pin is as good as highly intellectual poetry if the game creates as much pleasure. This critique is basically saying that hedonism seems to lower the overall intellect of humans because it implies that a game that could be considered unsophisticated, so a more modern example would be rock, paper, scissors, um, could be considered to be as good as a higher form of intellectual indulgence, such as reading poetry from Shakespeare, if they both bring the same amount of pleasure. Their argument is that this makes the intellectual property seem to be on the same level as something more primitive. Now we're going to be discussing a critique on classic utilitarianism. In section 4 of Armstrong's journal entry, in reference to what critiques might say, he states that classic utilitarianism seems to require that agents calculate all consequences of each act for every person for all time that's impossible. Or for all time, that's impossible. What this critique is saying is that a large flaw in classical utilitarianism lies within the fact that any action can cause an infinite number of consequences. It is impossible to list every single outcome of an action and to compare and impose normative properties on an action based on how good or bad the outcomes are expected to be. Um, so almost, if it is impossible to list out these infinite number of consequences, um, the critique is basically saying that it's unrealistic for this to be a good form of basing normative properties on an action, since you can't actually list out all of the consequences or all of the outcomes. Okay, now we're going to discuss a critique that can be found on utilitarians themselves instead of just utilitarianism. In section 5 of Armstrong's journal entry, he claims that similarly, critiques of utilitarianism often argue that utilitarians cannot be good friends because a good friend places more weight on the welfare of his or her friends than on the welfare of strangers. But utilitarianism requires impartiality among all people. This critique is basically saying that those who practice utilitarianism might not be good friends because due to utilitarianism's demand for impartiality, it'll conflict with the expectations of friendships such as loyalty, preference, and like the critique says, more weight on their friends' welfare. An example that would show this dilemma is, let's say, your friend needs $5,000 for a very important medical procedure, and this medical procedure would increase their overall quality of life. Okay? Now, at the same exact time that your friend asks you for the $5,000, someone walks up to you and asks if you want to donate $5,000 to a charity fund for cancer. Most people would expect a good friend to give the $5,000 to their close friend. However, someone who practices utilitarianism would be morally obligated to do whatever brings about the greatest outcome for the largest number of people. So they would give the $5,000 to the charity fund for cancer. Okay, critique on preference utilitarianism. Preference utilitarianism is, sorry, in section 3 of Armstrong's journal entry, he states that preference utilitarianism is also often criticized on the grounds that some preferences are misinformed, crazy, horrendous, or trivial. So, this critique is basically saying that preference utilitarianism um, holds preferences on the same level playing field when maybe they shouldn't be. So someone can have a preference for one political party, and it could be based on information that is completely untrue. They hadn't done any research behind it. Maybe they even made it up in their head. So because of this preference, if they feel as strong for this preference as someone does for the other political party, and let's say this person did the right amount of research, they made sure that they had fact checks, they made sure that everything that they argue for this preference can be cited with proper citations, um, they would be held on the same grounds simply because they prefer it, they prefer their own preference as strong as the other. So despite one being completely misinformed and despite one being properly informed, they would be on the same level for someone who practices preference utilitarianism. Another critique was on qualitative hedonism, and in Section 3, Armstrong states that even if qualitative hedonism is coherent and is a kind of hedonism, it still might not seem plausible. Some critiques argue that not all pleasures are valuable, since, for example, there is no value in the pleasures that a sadist gets from whipping a victim or that an addict gets from drugs. So, this critique is basically saying that there are going to be some people who chase pleasure um, for the wrong reasons. So, an example that this critique would likely point out is that someone could um, be deciding between reading Shakespeare or doing drugs. If this person would get more pleasure out of doing drugs, qualitative hedonism would um, say that the person should do drugs because it has the most pleasure. However, obviously, we know that that would not be the best choice for that person. 5 key sources that were used in this journal entry was Moore's Principia Ethica, Rawls' Two Concepts of Rules, Kagan's The Limits of Morality, Feldman's Utilitarianism, Hedonism, and Desert, New York. Um, Portmore's Can an Act Consequentialist Theory be Agent Relative? Now, I'm going to be talking about one ethical idea that I disagreed with. So in section 1 of Armstrong's journal entry, he discussed direct consequentialism. My issues with the idea of direct consequentialism stem from my basic disagreement that an action can be described as good or bad solely due to its outcome rather than its intention. For example, if an officer had chosen to risk their own safety to save 5 people during a natural disaster, but they had ill-intended ulterior motives, this would be considered a good act in the eyes of a direct consequentialist. This would not change, even if given the following knowledge. The officer was only saving these people for publicity, but not actually caring about the safety of these people he saved. So much to the extent that he would be happy if one of them were injured so that the story can gain more traction.